Queen Anne endured unimaginable heartbreak during her years of motherhood, suffering through 17 pregnancies in 17 years, with only one child surviving beyond infancy. Her repeated losses were a source of great sorrow, and for years, the cause of these tragedies remained a mystery. However, modern researchers have delved into her medical history and now believe they may have uncovered the reason behind her devastating experiences with pregnancy and childbirth. No one in England celebrated the birth of a future queen when Anne was born. She was the fourth child and second daughter of James, the Duke of York, who was the brother of King Charles II. At the time, Anne was fourth in line for the crown, making her prospects of becoming queen seem slim. However, the ever-unpredictable Game of Thrones soon worked in her favor as one by one, Anne's potential rivals were removed from the line of succession. Though her parents had 8 children in total, only 2, Anne and her older sister Mary, survived into adulthood. At just 6 years old, Anne faced a heartbreaking loss when her mother, Anne Hayde, passed away from cancer. Separated from her father, who was preoccupied with affairs of state, Anne and her sister were sent to live in Richmond, leaving her feeling isolated and alone. However, it was during this difficult time that she found an unexpected source of comfort and companionship in Sarah Jennings. 5 years older, Sarah was sharp, ambitious, and full of wit. Their bond grew quickly and became one of the most defining relationships of Anne's life, shaping not only her personal journey but also her reign as queen. Not long after Anne met Sarah, her father James shocked all of England. First, he made waves by converting to Catholicism, a highly controversial move in a Protestant nation. Then he remarried, taking the deeply Catholic Mary of Modena as his new wife, who, at 15 years old, was just 6 years older than Anne. Over the next decade, James and Mary of Modena had 10 children, but tragedy struck again and again. Each of their children was either stillborn or died in infancy, a heartbreaking reality that Anne herself would come to experience far too often in her own life. Amid Anne's numerous pregnancies, her father, James, arranged for her sister Mary to marry their cousin William of Orange. On the surface, it was a strategic political alliance that seemed logical. However, this decision would later come back to haunt James. By agreeing to the marriage, he unwittingly set the stage for his own downfall, as the union between Mary and William would ultimately play a pivotal role in the events that led to the Glorious Revolution and the end of his reign. In signing that marriage document, James had, in a sense, sealed his own grim fate. In 1683, at the age of 18, Anne married the handsome George of Denmark. Though their marriage was a stable and devoted one, it reportedly lacked the kind of passion seen in other royal unions. However, Anne's close relationships with the women in her life, especially her lifelong friend Sarah Churchill, more than made up for the absence of romantic spark. After their wedding, Anne and George moved into the Cockpit, a set of buildings within the Palace of Whitehall, where they began their life together. Their enduring bond would weather many challenges, but it was Anne's friendships that often took center stage. With Anne's new status came the need for an entirely fresh household staff. This moment marked a turning point in her relationship with Sarah Jennings, who by now had become Sarah Churchill. Churchill, once of modest, noble birth, suddenly found herself elevated to the position of one of Anne's ladies of the bedchamber. By securing this close role, Churchill began climbing the social ladder alongside Anne, and the newfound luxury and power ignited her ambition. Having experienced a taste of the high life, Sarah Churchill's drive for influence and wealth only grew, and she was determined to stop at nothing to get what she wanted. Within months of her marriage, Anne became pregnant with her first child but tragically suffered a miscarriage. She and George were determined, and over the next 2 years, Anne gave birth to 2 daughters. In 1685, Anne's uncle, King Charles II, died suddenly, and her father, James, ascended to the throne. His reign, however, was marked by controversy. Anglicans were already wary of James due to his Catholicism, but tensions worsened when he began appointing his Catholic allies to prominent positions. Anne, a devout Anglican, didn't share her father's religious views, which created a significant strain in their relationship. The breaking point came when James tried to force Anne to baptize her second daughter as a Catholic. Anne refused, and this led to an irreparable rift between them, further complicating an already fragile relationship. In 1687, Anne faced a devastating series of tragedies. Shortly after suffering yet another miscarriage, her husband George contracted smallpox, and soon their two infant daughters fell ill with the same deadly infection. While George eventually managed to recover, the young girls were far too fragile to survive. Within days of her miscarriage, Anne was struck with the unimaginable grief of losing both of her daughters. Their once lavish palace turned into a place of sorrow, and for months Anne and George mourned together, sometimes overwhelmed by uncontrollable sobs, other times sitting in painful, wordless silence as they kept vigil at George's sickbed. Before the year ended, Anne suffered yet another devastating stillbirth, adding to her growing heartache. But 1687 had one more blow in store for her. Her stepmother, Mary of Modena, became pregnant. For Anne, this pregnancy was deeply unsettling, as the birth of a son would likely mean that she would never ascend to the throne. In June of 1688, the worst-case scenario unfolded. Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. For Anne and her sister Mary, it was nothing short of a disaster. Not only were they now pushed out of the direct line of succession, but the new heir was a Catholic. This turn of events sent shockwaves through Anglican England, where the fear of a Catholic monarchy threatened both the nation's stability and the safety of its Protestant population. For Anne and Mary, the birth of their half-brother marked a critical and dangerous shift in their fortunes. 5 months after the birth of King James's son, England was thrust into upheaval with the arrival of William and Mary, marking the beginning of the Glorious Revolution. The Anglican people, already resentful of their Catholic monarch, eagerly embraced William and Mary as their new rulers. For King James, this was one of the most humiliating moments any English monarch had ever faced. His own daughter and son-in-law ousted him from the throne. With their victory, William and Mary ascended as the new king and queen, and Anne suddenly found herself back in the line of succession. Throughout this tumultuous period, Sarah Churchill remained at Anne's side, offering advice on nearly every matter. Churchill, ever perceptive, saw which way the political winds were blowing and encouraged Anne to side with her sister Mary and Mary's husband, William of Orange, against her father. Anne didn't need much convincing. Her relationship with James was already deeply strained. When James discovered that Anne, her husband George, and the Churchills had betrayed him by siding with William and Mary, he sought revenge, attempting to place them all under house arrest. Anne and Sarah narrowly escaped capture, fleeing down a back staircase of Anne's palace under the cover of night. This daring escape solidified the depth of their friendship and the intensity of the political upheaval swirling around Anne's life at that time. When King James learned of Anne's escape, he reportedly cried out in despair, "God help me. Even my children have forsaken me." With her father's downfall, Anne's position in the line of succession was restored, and in 1689 she gave birth to a son, an event that must have seemed like a turning point. Confident that her fortunes were about to improve under the rule of her sister Mary and brother-in-law William, Anne wasted no time in making grand requests. She asked for Richmond Palace and a hefty allowance from Parliament. To her shock, they refused her outright. Tensions began to rise between Anne and her sister Mary after William and Mary took the throne. Anne, who was next in line, had hoped that her husband George would receive a prominent position in the military, but William and Mary deliberately blocked him from any such opportunity. Over time, Anne began to understand what was happening. Although she was the rightful heir, the current king and queen were actively working to prevent her from gaining any influence or power. It became clear that her sister and brother-in-law saw Anne and George as a potential threat to their reign, creating a deep rift between the two sisters. Anne and Sarah Churchill were almost inseparable, their bond far deeper than what most people observed. Though a few raised eyebrows at the close relationship between a royal and her lady of the bedchamber, no one truly understood the dynamic behind closed doors. They even invented pet names for each other. Anne was Mrs. Morley, and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. The implication behind these names was clear. In private, they saw each other as equals, or at least that's what Anne believed. Despite her unwavering loyalty, Sarah Churchill secretly thought Anne was an idiot. Though she had devoted much of her life to serving the princess, she found Anne to be a dreadful conversationalist and considered her company extremely dull. However, once King James was overthrown, Churchill's attachment to Anne began to pay off handsomely. With William and Mary on the throne, Churchill's husband was elevated to the title of Duke of Marlborough and granted several important political positions. Sarah herself became a duchess, solidifying her status in the royal court. But it wasn't long before William and Mary began to notice the immense influence Sarah Churchill had over Anne. Concerned by how much sway Sarah held, Queen Mary demanded that Anne dismiss her close confidant. This confrontation marked the beginning of growing tensions between Anne and the royal couple, further complicating the web of power and loyalty at court. When Anne refused to submit to her sister's demands, Queen Mary took drastic action. She had Sarah Churchill forcibly removed from the royal household, signaling that her patience had run out. But Mary didn't stop there. She dismissed Anne's personal honor guard, banned courtiers from visiting her, and ordered government officials to ignore anything Anne said. The rift between the two sisters deepened, their hatred for each other now rivaling the resentment they both felt for their father. However, it was a final, heartless act by Mary that would shatter their relationship beyond repair. Soon after leaving the palace, Anne gave birth to another son, but tragically the baby died just minutes after being born. As Anne grieved this devastating loss, her sister, Queen Mary, came to visit. However, if Anne had hoped for comfort and condolences, she was sorely mistaken. Mary didn't visit to mourn her lost nephew. Instead, she seized the opportunity to scold Anne over her close friendship with Sarah Churchill. For Anne, who was already heartbroken and vulnerable, lying in grief over her lost son, hearing her sister berate her about her best friend was the final straw. This moment marked the breaking point in their relationship, deepening the emotional and political divide between the two sisters and forever altering their bond. After that fateful day, Anne and Mary never reconciled, and they never saw each other again. In 17th century England, no one was immune to the ravages of disease, not even royalty. Shortly after their final argument, Queen Mary contracted smallpox. The illness struck quickly, and despite her status, she succumbed after a brief and brutal battle in 1694. With Mary gone, Anne became the undisputed heir to the throne. However, she was painfully aware that her exiled father, King James, was still in France, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim his crown. The looming threat cast a dark shadow over her future. Anne found herself in an increasingly precarious political position, but her personal struggles were even more overwhelming. While she had never enjoyed robust health, her gout had worsened significantly, leaving her in near constant pain. By this point, her condition was so severe that she could barely walk, relying on servants to push her around in a wheelchair. As her health declined, so did her appearance. The once proud princess no longer cared about her clothing, and her dresses became dirty and tattered. Her feet were almost always bound in painful, gruesome bandages, and her face, once fair, grew ruddy and spotted. The physical toll of her illness left Anne suffering not only from her political isolation, but also from the misery of her deteriorating health, which consumed much of her energy and spirit. As her so-called best friend Sarah Churchill cruelly noted, Anne had become exceedingly gross and corpulent. Anne had already endured an unimaginable amount of heartbreak in her attempts to become a mother, but the most devastating loss was still to come. In July 1700, just months after suffering her 12th stillbirth, Anne's only surviving child, 11-year-old Prince William, was suddenly taken from her. After nearly 2 decades of pregnancies and losses, Anne's final hope for motherhood was gone. Historians documented that the boy's death left both Anne and her husband utterly shattered, overwhelmed with grief that would linger for the rest of their lives. A year later, in 1701, Anne's father, the exiled King James, passed away. Following his death, Anne received a letter from her despised stepmother, Mary of Modena. In it, Mary begged Anne to restore James's bloodline by recognizing her own son, James Francis Edward Stuart, as the rightful heir and making him king after William's death. However, in a twist of fate, it was William who died first in 1702, and Anne ascended the throne as Queen of England. The English people celebrated her reign with enthusiasm. Although they had tolerated William over the deposed Catholic king, he was still a foreigner from the Netherlands. With Anne, they finally had what they longed for, a native-born English Anglican monarch. Anne's coronation was far from the grand spectacle many might have expected. Crippled by excruciating gout, she was unable to walk the traditional route to Westminster Abbey and had to be carried in a sedan chair by her servants. Despite her physical frailty, Anne's reign marked a monumental achievement in British history. Under her leadership, England and Scotland were unified as a single country, Great Britain, after centuries of conflict and war between the two nations. This act of union in 1707 created a unified parliament, and Anne became the first ever Queen of Great Britain, solidifying her legacy despite the personal struggles that plagued her reign. Queen Anne's coronation must have felt like the ultimate victory for Sarah Churchill. She had aligned herself with Anne long before she became queen, and now it was time for her loyalty to pay off. By this point, Sarah was accustomed to having Anne heed her every word and trusted that her influence would remain unchallenged. However, a new figure soon entered the scene, Abigail Hill, Sarah's own cousin, though from the less privileged branch of the family. Unlike Sarah, who basked in the luxuries of nobility, Abigail had experienced a far more modest upbringing. The Hill family had faced financial hardship, forcing Abigail to work as a servant, a position far removed from the power Sarah wielded. Sarah Churchill played a key role in pulling Abigail Hill, her impoverished relative, out of a difficult situation, though it wasn't necessarily out of pure kindness. Most likely, Churchill found it deeply embarrassing to have a family member working as a lowly servant and wanted to elevate Abigail's status to save face. Regardless of her motives, Churchill took Abigail into her own household, unknowingly setting the stage for her own undoing. Through this connection, Abigail managed to secure a job in Queen Anne's palace, a move that would have far-reaching consequences for Churchill as Abigail's influence over the Queen grew in unexpected ways. In 1704, Anne quickly grew fond of her young maid Abigail Hill, who was everything Sarah Churchill wasn't. While Sarah was fierce, domineering, and endlessly ambitious, Abigail was gentle, kind, and compassionate. Anne, who had been mistreated by many people throughout her life, found solace in Abigail's warmth and understanding. The bond between them deepened, and before Sarah knew it, Abigail had become a trusted confidant to the Queen. By the time Churchill realized the shift in her once unchallenged influence over Anne, it was too late. Abigail had quietly taken her place in Anne's affections. By the time Abigail Hill entered Queen Anne's life, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, had risen to become a highly influential figure. Her growing responsibilities meant she spent less and less time at the royal palaces, leaving her unaware of the deep bond that had formed between Anne and Abigail. It wasn't until 1707, 3 years after Abigail's arrival, that Sarah finally learned of their close relationship. When she returned to court and saw how close Anne and Abigail had become, she was utterly shocked. The friendship between the Queen and Abigail took her completely by surprise, leaving her reeling from the realization that her own influence over Anne had begun to wane. Not only had Anne arranged for Abigail to marry a gentleman from her household, but she had also provided her with a substantial dowry from the privy purse, something that infuriated Sarah Churchill, as she was the keeper of the privy purse herself. To Sarah, this was a personal betrayal. Things escalated when Sarah returned to Anne's palace one day to discover that Abigail had moved into her private rooms. a blatant sign that Abigail was now taking her place, not just in Anne's heart, but in her position of power. This marked the beginning of the unraveling of Sarah's once dominant influence over the Queen. In a fit of revenge, Sarah Churchill commissioned a writer to create a scandalous poem that implied Queen Anne and Abigail Hill were involved in a lesbian relationship. The poem sparked a storm of rumors and gossip throughout the court, tarnishing both Anne and Abigail's reputations. But Sarah didn't stop at spreading rumors. She took things a step further by writing a scathing letter to Anne, including excerpts from the defamatory poem. In the letter, Sarah chillingly threatened the Queen with the line, "Such things are in my power that, if known, might lose a crown," making it clear that she was willing to expose secrets that could end Anne's reign. Anne had long since abandoned the hope of having more children, but tragedy still loomed over her life. In 1708, her beloved husband, Prince George, passed away, leaving her utterly devastated and alone. At a time when she desperately needed comfort and support, Anne turned to Sarah Churchill. However, Sarah was anything but compassionate. Instead of offering solace, Sarah's behavior took a sharp turn. From the moment of Prince George's death, Sarah began to dominate and boss Anne around, showing no sensitivity to the Queen's grief. This harshness became the final straw in their already deteriorating relationship, marking the end of their once close friendship. After the death of Queen Anne's beloved husband George, Sarah Churchill's behavior became even more domineering. In a brazen act, Sarah immediately removed George's portrait from Anne's bedchamber, then demanded that the grieving queen move to a different palace. Instead of offering comfort, Sarah began bossing Anne around with more intensity than ever. But it was the subject of Abigail Hill that truly ignited their conflict. Sarah relentlessly mocked Anne for her closeness with Abigail, going as far as to call her stupid. The constant bullying escalated to the point that Anne felt compelled to write a letter to Sarah's husband, pleading with him to intervene. In the letter, Anne begged him to make Sarah stop teasing and tormenting her, and to behave with the decency and respect that was expected toward both a friend and, more importantly, the Queen. Anne finally reached her breaking point and decided she would no longer tolerate Sarah Churchill's overbearing behavior. She forced Sarah to officially resign from all her offices, delivering a decisive blow to their long-standing friendship. As a final act of defiance, Anne appointed Abigail Hill as the new keeper of the Privy Purse, a position that had once belonged to Sarah. The Duchess of Marlborough had finally overplayed her hand. After years of manipulating her relationship with Anne for personal gain, her reign of influence came to an abrupt end. But don't feel too bad for Sarah. By the time she passed away at the age of 84, she had amassed an enormous fortune and was one of the wealthiest women in Europe. Anne continued to shower rewards upon her cherished Abigail. Although Abigail had made significant strides, her low-born status had always limited her actual power. However, that all changed when Anne took the unprecedented step of creating 12 new peers in the House of Lords. Among these new titles was one granted to Abigail's husband, elevating her to the status of an official noble. On the same day that Abigail was made a baroness, Anne also dismissed the Duke of Marlborough, Sarah's husband, from his position as commander of the army. This bold move not only solidified Abigail's newfound status, but also underscored the shifting dynamics within the court and the complexities of Anne's relationships with those around her. Anne had struggled with poor health for most of her life, but after her fallout with Sarah Churchill, her condition took a significant turn for the worse. By March 1714, she seemed to be on the brink of death. Following months spent confined to her sickbed, Anne suffered a stroke on July 30th, and this time there would be no recovery. She passed away on August 1st, and her doctor, John Arbuthnot, regarded her death as a release from her long suffering. After years of enduring pain, Arbuthnot later reflected, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveler than death was to her." His words encapsulated the sense of relief that came with her passing, marking the end of her prolonged agony. Queen Anne undoubtedly endured a physical condition that went undiagnosed during her lifetime. In addition to her constant pain, she faced extraordinarily traumatic childbirth experiences. Now, centuries later, scientists believe they may have identified the underlying cause of her suffering. Based on her symptoms and experiences, autoimmune diseases such as lupus or Hughes syndrome appear to be the most likely explanations. These conditions would not only account for Anne's numerous difficult pregnancies, but also the other painful symptoms she experienced throughout her life, providing a clearer understanding of the challenges she faced as a monarch. In her final years, Anne had become almost completely sedentary, leading to severe obesity. By the time of her death, her coffin was reportedly so massive that it required 14 men to carry it. However, this was far from the most humiliating indignity Anne faced in death. That distinction belonged to Sarah Churchill. In her memoirs, Churchill did not hold back, portraying Anne as a fool of a queen who would have achieved nothing without her guidance. This scathing assessment added another layer of shame to Anne's legacy, as the once powerful monarch was reduced to a figure of ridicule in the eyes of history. However, Sarah Churchill had a tendency to look down on just about everyone, not solely Anne. The truth is, Anne's legacy is quite remarkable. She was a woman and the second daughter of the king's brother, who managed to outlive everyone ahead of her to ascend to the throne during a time of incredible prosperity. Unlike her predecessors, she took a more active role in Parliament, influencing governance more than any monarch before her. Her reign was marked by significant advancements in the arts, economy, science, and politics, achievements that are all the more impressive considering the numerous tragedies she endured throughout her life. Anne's story reflects a complex and inspiring journey, showcasing her resilience in the face of adversity. It turns out Queen Anne was quite a remarkable figure in her own right. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more intriguing stories soon.